Whomsoever wishes to fight monsters should make sure that he himself does not become a monster in the process. For if you gaze into the abyss for too long, the abyss gazes back into you. Salutations, brothers and sisters, and today we are going to be talking about the eponymous slayers of monsters and men, the mutant beast hunters and the heartless professionals of Sapkowski's stories, the Wiccans, the Hexers, the Witchers. Long ago, when the world was young and the races of men had only just mastered the magical arts, giant beasts and uncounted lesser monsters plagued humanity at every corner. Fiends and giants slaughtered entire villages. Griffins and wyverns devastated vast herds of livestock. Leshins and hags infested the forests, and ghouls and rot fiends would not leave even the dead to rot in peace. And while humans could and did defend themselves by building walls, lighting fires, and keeping vast amounts of guards on duty at all times, they only expanded slowly, and every venture beyond the safety of the local colony was basically a death sentence for a regular man. And so it was that, despite their victory over the non-humans, the humans saw that most of the land their kings now claimed was, in reality, ruled by nature and its eldritch abominations. The new cast of human sorcerers saw this danger and attempted to find a way how to defeat the beasts and let man take his rightful place as master of nature. Now, it is not known whether their final solution was their initial one, but I would argue that creating a mutant monster slayer with speed, reflexes, durability and strength turned up to 21, and make him artificially magically potent, sounds like an insane enough idea that it could have been conceived by the sorcerers right from the beginning. And so that is precisely what they did. In a sense, their decision to create a new cast of killer machines specifically designed to kill monsters makes a lot of sense. After all, the worst part of a monster attack always were the casualties associated with it. If they could create a warrior who could deal with the various nasties one-on-one, they would, in effect, be saving lives. On the other hand, creating a mutant much better at killing stuff than you are, torturing him during his transformation for a bit, and embedding in him a distinct urge to kill things. Yeah, I'm not sure why that raised no red flags from anyone. Or well, maybe it did. As with all the old lore, we are not actually sure how the first Witchers were created. We know the general info, the gist of things, but the details are a bit shaky, to say the absolute least. What we do know is that many sorcerers all around the human-populated world started founding so-called Witcher schools, fortresses located far from prying eyes, usually in the middle of wilderness, where they could proceed with their experiments uninterrupted by such petty human concerns as morality and work ethics. Are you kidding me? These fortresses were presumably built through now lost magical means, though some may have simply been bought from local barons or discovered by the sorcerers, forgotten relics of past civilizations. One way or the other, the wizards in question usually placed these fortresses within areas where they had easy access to everything they would require for what followed. For what followed were dozens upon dozens of years, if not decades and centuries, of trial and error, which killed or permanently damaged gods only know how many young initiates. I mean, I can only imagine all the horrible side effects, the psychic and physical trauma of failed test subjects, the murderous rampages so many of these proto-witches must have succumbed to, and actually, it might be best not to imagine it. Safe to say, modern mortality rates amongst young witches probably pale in comparison. Yet after what must have been a lifetime of alchemical and magical experimentation, mutation, and genetic enhancement, some of the mages did eventually produce their desired killing machines, the Witchers. monster slayers sent out into the world to cleanse it of beasts and prepare mankind's ascendance. Wait, Lore Master, what exactly even is a Witcher then? A mutant? A man? A monster in human form even? Well, ask 7 different creatures and you get 7 very different answers. Potentially 14 if one of them is a mage. To your average peasant, a Witcher is a creature often more terrifying than the beasts it is bred to slay, a cold-blooded murderer who lives only to rip the poor man's hard-earned coins from him in exchange for his bloody work, and helps himself to his food and bed and daughters in the process. And true, while he might slay the monster plaguing the village, he is not to be parleyed with, nor should he be trusted, for he commands sinister forces, and with his evil glare can seduce men and women alike to commit most unspeakable acts. The vast majority of priestly orders take this 3 steps further. As an infamous, or famous, depending on who you ask, source known as monstrum, or a hexer's likeness, describes their viewpoint extremely accurately. Verily, there is nothing so hideous as the monsters, so contrary to nature, known as witchers, for they are the offspring of foul sorcery and devilry. They are rogues without virtue, conscience, or scruple, true diabolic creations fit only for killing. There is no place amidst honest men for such as they. To nobility and kings, witchers are mostly a necessary annoyance, since most witchers find it extremely tough to show respect that these lordlings presume they deserve, and they are never cheap. A witcher's natural self-confidence, coupled with their innate sense of professionalism and skepticism, and a life on the fringes of society as well, means it is very challenging to find a witcher willing to simply kneel and serve and grovel like a good subject, which is precisely the attitude most princes and barons of the continent demand. Witchers also try to never pick sides in human squabbles, which highly irritates those who would use them as hired assassins or shock troops in wars. Yet they do value a witcher's sense of honor, mostly because they can easily exploit it and their effectiveness, and so are not quite as unwelcoming to the hexers as the priests and the peasants. If you ask a merchant or any other businessman, he will initially swear with all the curse words known to him at the price the weakens demand for their services, and then praise them to high heavens for their professional attitude, good haggling skills, and the cold brutality and methodical perfection of their kills. Merchants, after all, value skill and expertise above all else, and the Witcher has bucket loads of both, if he is worth his name, that is. Merchants and various rich men, therefore, are some of the more thankful clients a Witcher can get hired by, since they do appreciate the Witchers for who they really are, even if they do frequently try to swindle them with the prices. Finally, sorcerers usually use 2 words to describe a Witcher: test, subject. Or paramour if we're talking about sorceresses, but that is a story for another, preferably less sober time. You have to understand, to the best of our knowledge, all the sorcerers, and I mean all the sorcerers, who participated in the creation of the Witchers are now deceased, most of them killed either by their test subjects or by other means, and they took the specifics of the Witcher mutations and abilities to their graves, not being able, or willing, to share them with their colleagues in time. This, naturally, saddens the remaining sorcerers versed in the gentle art of gen-hancing and mutation to no ends, since the Witchers are without a doubt the most potent form of artificial mutation in the world, and the only thing that can raise their spirits from this terrible, awful depression is kidnapping a Witcher, which, mind you, is pretty difficult as it stands, sedating him, an even more difficult task, as ludicrous as that seems, and then poking various sharp, spiky objects, usually filled with gallons of potent toxins, narcotics, and magical shrooms, into his body. And if, or let's be honest here, when is the more accurate word, the unfortunate lab rat should die, sorcerers will pay a fortune to buy his body parts and organs for further examination. For sorcerers versed in other magical fields, Witchers range from useless freaks and insults towards nature to maniacal killers of dying species, from pawns to be played to potential political partners, and from temporary distractions to full-time lovers in some cases. Sorcerers are a fickle bunch, no doubt that's an understatement, and any witcher, or any person in general actually, who finds himself at the center of their attention should remain wary, and remember that a sorcerer's motivations and preferences can, and frequently do, change on a whim. Finally, for most monsters, a witcher is their worst nightmare, the stuff of terrors made manifest, and an almost unkillable opponent. Most monsters sentient enough to comprehend the concept of death hate and loathe the witchers above all else, and will do their best to avoid and or kill any witchers they happen to come across during their lives. For to a monster, there is nothing more terrifying than a predator that cannot be intimidated, avoided, or bargained with, and one that is damn hard to kill. The greatest dream of all sentient monsters is to find a defenseless, helpless witcher and slowly, very slowly, torture him to death, as is evidenced in the books. Monsters might even, on occasion, form shaky alliances with other monstrous species to kill a witcher in their close proximity, forsaking petty local rivalries and cooperating to try and kill the beast slayer before he starts to pick them off one by one. To a monster, a witcher, put plain and simple, is the real monster. But as we know, the most important aspect for any person is who they consider themselves to be. So, what do the hexers think of themselves? Well, that varies. But let us first strip them down to their core. A witcher is a monster slayer, designed specifically to hunt down and kill a variety of nasty fauna and occasionally flora roaming the continent. They are selected from young boys, usually orphans, but not necessarily, we'll get to that in a moment, put under rigorous Spartan-like training, then subjected to extensive mutations and chemical alterations, and are then equipped with the best weapons and gadgets money can buy and let loose into the world. Sounds simple enough, but it is actually far more complex. First off, I'll leave the Witcher training and creation to its own separate video, since it is probably the most extensive part of their lore. I will though name the results of these processes. Starting off with strength, your average Witcher is a bit stronger than your average human, though the difference is not an overwhelming one. The Witcher won't be throwing men 3 meters into the air anytime soon, though some Witchers have been known to literally rip men and monsters to pieces with their hands, and their sword blows are powerful enough to rip through plate armor. They will almost certainly beat your average boxer in a 1v1, but hitting monsters harder should never be a Witcher's primary objective in battle, if he wants to live to fight another one, that is. A Witcher's main advantage is his enhanced speed and especially his reflexes. Witchers are capable of moving at an almost imperceptible speed over short distances and have been seen deflecting crossbow bolts with their swords, though don't expect them to pull some force nonsense and deflect concentrated fire from multiple enemies at once. That's a bit too much of a fantasy trope for even the Witchers to pull off. There are countless instances in the books where Geralt moves literally faster than the eye can catch, and while a Witcher is no Flash, he is most certainly several times stronger than most humans. Faster than his opponent's blow, anyway, and that is usually enough. A Witcher also has quite the impressive stamina, as he is fully capable of running and fighting for extended periods of time with relative ease. At one point, Geralt, after a full day of running and skirmishing and generally just doing a lot of tiring, gruesome work, fights in a several hours long protracted battle, leading from the front with absolutely no rest, and is still able to stand on his feet after the fighting is done. Their stamina also helps them pass through difficult terrain such as cliffsides and rocky mountainous regions, and is also quite useful in a more private endeavor. However, while the Witchers are fully capable of dueling their prey for hours on end, they much prefer to dispatch their targets swiftly, for the more tired a Witcher gets, the more likely he is to make a mistake. and as they say, a faulty Witcher is a dead Witcher. All of these characteristics, inhuman reflexes and speed, coupled with enhanced strength and stamina, complemented by years of rigorous training, means that a Witcher fights like no other warrior in his world, or indeed in our medieval Europe. To elaborate, the basic driving principle of most societies' combat strategies was pretty much to be able to take as much punishment as possible and still be able to fight more or less successfully, and so their weapons evolved to be very good at piercing or otherwise damaging the extremely heavy armor they wore. After all, a human makes mistakes, especially in stressful situations, and so it is always better to be able to take a hit and kill your enemy slower than to be able to kill him quickly, but also be able to die just as fast. And for any experts in medieval combat who may be watching this, I know I'm egregiously oversimplifying here, yet one must remember the catch with most monstrous species is that they do not give a toss about the enemy's armor. Most have claws or fangs capable of grinding stone to powder, others breathe fire or noxious gas, or spit acid, or have wings that allow them to lift their opponents in the air, or generally cheat in many other ways. Overall, when fighting most monsters, heavy armor will only slow you down, and reducing your speed is basically a death sentence. Instead, the Witchers have developed a combat system more closely resembling that of Eastern martial artists, focusing on speed and deftness of movement, precise strikes in the opponent's weak points, all the while employing a wide range of sidearms and other gadgets, including bombs, poison-coated blades, elixirs to enhance one's reflexes, stamina, strength or perception, throwing knives or throwing stars, and even small one-handed crossbows, though, to be frank, most Witcher schools shun both ranged and mounted combat as ineffective and inadequate. Part of the reason why is that most bolts will only down smaller beasts in one shot, and you are usually not going to have the time to reload the damn thing before the Griblies reach your position, and because horses, even the few specially bred Witcher horses, and yes, there are Witcher horses, very few, but they exist, will generally get spooked by the Witcher's quarry, and will usually seek to forcibly dismount their riders before making a run for it. In short, a Witcher fights in a way real-world schools of fencing can scantily describe or compare, since his superhuman speed and strength allows him to effortlessly perform acts that would get a regular human swordsman killed. If anything, he is closer to a royal musketeer than a medieval knight in his combat technique, and blends Eastern and Western fighting styles in a bizarre yet beautiful combination of a swirling dance of death. There are, of course, other, less and more pronounced effects. During the changes, secondary mutations that all young Witchers undergo, young Witchers are implanted with several new organs and supplementary glands. The most noticeable of these are their trademark feline eyes. Geralt describes the process, indirectly, as particularly painful, as it most likely involves a lot of sharp, pointy objects and vile liquids in close proximity to the man's eye. However, if the surgery is successful, which doesn't always go according to plan, but hey, acceptable losses and all that, Witchers gain the ability to see even in pitch black, and the eyes also lend them an air of mystical menace, which is actually more important than it seems at first glance. Apart from this very visible cosmetic effect, Witchers also have sharper sense of hearing and smell, nowhere near Daredevil levels of super hearing, but enough to say dodge a strike from the back, or follow a recent trail of monster stench even if the wind is blowing. Most notably, however, mutations drastically slow a Witcher's aging process. Geralt, who has the appearance and physical prowess of a man in his late 20s to early 30s, is said to be almost 80 years old at the start of the saga, and Vesemir, the one Witcher who actually shows some signs of advanced age, is said to be almost as ancient as the fortress he inhabits, meaning at least a couple hundred years old. How the mutations achieve this is beyond me, honestly, but I imagine it has something to do with a certain very special something implanted into young initiates during the changes. More on that later. Yet we cannot actually deduce how long a Witcher's average lifespan is, and the reason why is best described in a common northern saying: no Witcher has ever died in his bed. One more important change is that it makes the initiates, even those with absolutely no magical talent, artificially linked to the winds of magic during the changes, giving them limited ability to channel the forces of chaos into the mortal plane in the form of signs. Signs are basically utilitarian spells, very basic hexes that nevertheless can have a dramatic, albeit brief effect. Common signs include the likes of Ard, a very basic form of telekinesis, Axia, a form of advanced hypnosis, Igni, the most basic pyromantic trick, Quen, which serves as a sort of warding spell around its target, and Yrden, a runic trap as it is commonly called, able to slow down and even trap magical entities for a limited period of time. Even though these might sound impressive on paper, and believe me, you don't want to find yourself on the receiving end of one, true natural-born sorcerers mock and scold the signs as basically nothing better than parlor tricks, no better than card game illusions or pulling rabbits from your hat. Still, it is necessary to remark that even connecting someone to the winds of magic artificially is a pretty monumental achievement on its own, and while the sorcerers find them mostly amusing, you will quickly come to understand that there are few things in the world sorcerers don't find worthy of condescension. But I have already mentioned the term Witcher School, so I feel like I should elaborate. A Witcher School is, in the most basic terms, a training facility that produces new generations of Witchers from young recruited boys, but it is also so much more than that. First off, don't even think of comparing it to Hogwarts, since the last time I checked, most Hogwarts professors weren't trying to kill their students intentionally. Well, that can actually be put to question. And most students actually survived their study at the school. Again, most. A Witcher school could best be compared to the Hashashin Fortress Sanctuary, Alamut, in the real world. We only ever see one school in the books, Kaer Morhen, which could roughly be translated to Sea Fort, the seat and base of the School of the Wolf, but we can assume that most Witcher schools have similar seats. For its part, Kaer Morhen is an old, partially ruined and surprisingly well-hidden fortress located in northeastern Kedwen, deep in the monster-infested valleys of the Blue Mountains. It possesses training grounds for the Witchers to train, armory from which they can resupply and refit their weapons, a library in which they can search for the information they require, a laboratory where the trials of the grasses can take place, and which the Witchers can use to brew their concoctions and poisons, and even barracks in which the Witchers can sleep and store their meager personal possessions. The fortresses are permanently inhabited only by the recruits and their training masters. However, fully fledged Witchers often return to their fortresses to wait out the long, cold winters of the north, for reasons we will get into later. Yet Witcher schools are not only places, they are also doctrines of combat and a code of conduct. The combat principles of individual schools vary greatly, and we know very little about any school besides the School of the Wolf, yet we know of at least two other canon schools, the School of the Cat and the School of the Griffin, and three more schools that have been added in by CD Projekt Red: School of the Viper, School of the Bear, and School of the Manticore. I will not try to summarize them all, but do forgive me for the briefness of these introductions, for we know almost nothing of some of these schools. So, School of the Wolf. Geralt's school acts as the sort of kind of vanilla Witchers of the story, seated in Kedwen, and its adherents usually operate within the Northern Kingdoms. In combat, they prefer a jack-of-all-trades approach, using signs, swords, and potions in approximately equal amount. They are taught to follow the Witcher Code, which we will talk about in a moment, and there does seem to be a level of camaraderie and shared martial culture between its members. School of the Cat Great rivals of the School of the Wolf are known for producing particularly psychotic and aggressive witchers and for having no moral code or scrutinies about being hired to kill both men and monsters. Basically, the direct opposite of the School of the Wolf. They are often found as hired thugs or assassins and are one of the main reasons why the witchers get a bad rap in the north. Why the other witcher schools have not yet banded together to simply destroy or neutralize this school is kinda beyond me. They also produce the only known elven witchers in the setting, and take after the elves in their combat preferences as well, focused on expert blade work and martial prowess. School of the Griffin, known for being particularly altruistic and less socially awkward, and presumably adhering to the Witcher code. They are the good witchers of the setting. They focus heavily on magic in their combat, using advanced signs and even basic forms of spells in their fights. School of the Bear. Seated in the Skellige Isles, bear witchers are known for their great size and strength, as well as immense tolerance to toxins, being able to ingest unusual amounts of witcher brews at the same time. This is probably at least partially due to the non-toxic concoction that passes for alcohol in Skellige. It is unknown whether they adhere to the Witcher code, but they do not seem to be particularly disliked amongst the populace, so it is likely that they do, at least in some aspects. School of the Viper. Lefos school and my personal favorite, this school is seated somewhere in Nilfgaard. Its main focus is on poisons and short blades, making them lethal and capable assassins, but are also more of a jack of all trades when it comes to fighting monsters, similar to the School of the Wolf. Also possessed one of the greatest stores of knowledge in their fort, with many tomes particularly concerned with the phenomenon of the wild hunt. However, in modern days, their fort has been lost and their school disbanded. The ones we meet in games have become assassins, though unlike the cats, the Vipers did not murder merely for profit, but with a certain, very specific goal in mind. School of the Manticore, based in Zerikania and probably Hawkland. And that is precisely everything we know about them. See, I told you there was very little info about them, and we don't even have their symbol or their crest or generally anything about them. By this point, you probably really want me to explain what the famous Witcher code actually is, don't you? So, I will tell you. One of the greatest secrets, the mystery of the Witchers, guarded for centuries. The core tenets of the Witcher code is that it actually doesn't exist. Or well, it does and it doesn't. It's complicated. So, there is nothing like a written Codex Astartes for the Witchers, no guidebook they should follow word for word, similarly to how there never was a written rulebook of the Code of Chivalry. There is no universal rulebook every Witcher carries in his brooches and operates according to its rules. No, the Witcher code is something very personal, a general set of rules taught to all young Witchers upon the completion of their training. It shapes the Witcher as a professional, as an expert. It helps set them apart and shape their reputation among their populace. Here are some of its basic tenets. A Witcher is neutral. Witchers are not supposed to take sides in human conflicts, whether that be to assist a local alderman clear a group of bandits, or to end up in the services of a king or warlord in a large-scale war. Witchers, no matter their personal beliefs and preferences, are only ever allowed to draw human blood in self-defense. A Witcher never breaks a contract. Once the contract is signed, only two options are open to the Witcher who accepted it: success or death. There are few Witchers who are as despised as contract breakers, and those Witchers who fail in finishing their contract are lucky if they are ever hired again, since their employers will make sure to let as many people as possible know of their failure. A Witcher never accepts a human contract. Witchers were made for more than to be hired killers and mercenaries, and taking out contracts on humans, even unwanted criminals, and even in times of need for the Witcher, is strictly prohibited. It is seen as both lazy and an insult to the Witcher profession, to waste a Witcher's talents for killing mere mortals and criminals. A Witcher never kills innocents. One of the trickier rules of the code, since it is usually up to the individual Witcher to decide whether or not a creature he has been hired to kill poses a threat to humans. Then again, the entire code is pretty flexible and individual Witchers can and do modify most rules to fit their needs. If he rules the creature in question is not a threat and thus not require slaying, he is obliged to return any form of payment he had received in advance for the contract, thus annulling it. A Witcher never accepts a permanent position in service to a lord. For one, this would mean partially taking a side, but even if he were to be simply hired as, say, a royal monster slayer, he is obliged to refuse. A huge part of the Witcher martial culture consists of the path. It is a Witcher's way of life to never stay in one place for too long, to be always on the move, forever living a nomadic lifestyle with next to no personal possessions and no attachments, so that he is always able to travel to where his services are most required. Settling down is considered, while not outright disgraceful, as wasteful and a betrayal of your talents and abilities. A Witcher always demands payment for his work. It may seem strange to have this as a rule, but it is explicitly stated in one of Geralt's short stories that if Witchers were to suddenly start acting out of the goodness of their heart and live off people's charity, it would quickly outsource the less skilled or empathetic Witchers who would still demand payment and set a dangerous precedent. This does not mean that Witchers have to be as rigorous as tax collectors and giving discounts or otherwise bargaining with your clients about the price is perfectly well, like it is even necessary, to the point where haggling is considered as important for a Witcher as his sword and spells. This is also the reasons why all Witchers are, apart from their combat training, also taught how to read, write, deal in finances, and the basics of the laws of the land. A Witcher never hunts dragons. This is something I'll delve further into in my dragon lore video, but the crux of the problem is that Witchers are supposed to be solitary hunters, lone wolves, and it is far in excess of one man, even a Witcher, to take down a dragon. Specialized companies of dragon slayers exist for that, equipped and trained in a manner almost entirely alien to that of the Witchers, and an unspoken agreement exists between the two groups. Witchers hunt monsters, but dragon slayers hunt dragons. Of course, there are exceptions to every rule, but when that rule is large, armored, and filled with nothing but teeth, fire, and bad temper, you are more inclined to oblige it. A Witcher can invoke the law of surprise. This is actually a folk belief picked right out of Slavic mythology, and it should be noted that Witchers are by far not the only ones who have the right to invoke this ancient law. In practice, it is a folk belief that if a person saves your life without having received any sort of payment for it in advance, meaning he was not paid or incited to rescue you, he can choose the law of surprise instead of conventional form of payment. The law exists in two very distinct versions. The first and more common is phrased, "Give me what belongs to you, but you do not yet know you possess," and the second is, "Give me the first thing you set your sight on upon returning to your home." Due to this being a fantasy setting, in both cases this is usually nothing as mundane as a kettle or a chicken, but usually a child, known thereafter as Child of Surprise, and it is believed these children are then bound by fate to the person who invoked the law. This was the second largest source of Witcher recruits, although Witchers are not obliged to call upon the law if they rescue someone, and indeed, in modern days, most prefer a hefty sack of gold to a potential recruit. This has, however, had the negative effect on the Witcher reputation, as it helped spawn the myth of Witchers kidnapping children from their parents, back when the Witchers had to invoke the law more often to sustain and replenish their numbers. And finally, perhaps the most important rule, the Witcher is never, ever under no circumstances, even if tortured, allowed to speak of the specifics of the Witcher Code. Of course, you now know that there is no official Witcher Code, and this rule helps keep it as such, flexible and individualist. Witchers can often reject unwanted contracts or offers by citing from the code, never actually having to prove that it says what they claim it says. Then again, other people are, for the most part, not idiots, and they will get the hint even if they may have their suspicions. The non-existence of the Witcher Code, therefore, is one of the most open secrets in the North. Witchers, as mentioned, walk the path, meaning their lifestyle is nomadic and restless, never stopping for long, never settling down, always in the saddle, always on the road. The only home they might have, and even then we can only confirm that the School of the Wolf has ever had such a practice, is their fortress school, the training yard / base of operations of their order. Witchers are allowed to return to their school once a year, to wait out the infamous northern winters, but also to bring back any trophies they might have gained, share their talents and new experiences with their colleagues, and generally spend time with possibly the only other beings who accept them for what they are, others of their own kind. However, once the snows thaw out and spring returns, most Witchers, since the training masters, are obliged to return to the path. Only when the Witcher suffers a crippling injury, unlikely, or if he manages to reach an old age, highly unlikely, is he permitted to become a training master and abandon the path for good. Few Witchers desire such a fate, and even fewer live to see it. Due to this, Witchers are counted as some of the world-weariest individuals, since they have likely traveled their part of the world several times over throughout their long lifespans. They do, however, try and make a name for themselves in certain areas, where people will be more likely to hire them again should trouble arise. Reputation is of great import to a Witcher, as mentioned numerous times before, and he will strive to improve whenever and wherever he can, if he knows what is good for him. Because, you see, people don't generally like Witchers. It's surprising, I know. No, that is an understatement. I need to think of a better comparison. Think of it like this. To your regular peasant, a Witcher represents the rough equivalent of what a Zulu warrior represents to a KKK member. The personification of all the worst aspects of what he has been told to despise and abhor throughout his upbringing by pretty much everyone around him. To most common folk, Witchers are basically monsters themselves, even worse in fact, since they actually used to be human. And it does not help that the DNA of some monstrous species is actually used during the trial of the grasses, lending credence to the belief that Witchers are created via all kinds of demonic pacts and selective monster breeding. But it is a Witcher's appearance and methods more than anything else that makes him a pariah to humans. The cat eyes, often unnatural hair color, scars and battle damage on their faces, along with uncommon armor design and 2 swords on their backs, create an air of unease and mystery around the Witcher. And if there is one thing an average person hates, it is that which he does not understand. And if the Witcher's appearance is not quite enough to make a peasant reach for a pitchfork if he ever comes across him, his methods and skills will most certainly finish the job. Witchers treat their profession as science, a strict and precise one at that, pretty much exactly opposite to how a local herbalist or a witch doctor would treat it. What a local shaman solves with prayer and sacrifice by full moon, a Witcher solves with selecting an adequate bait, coating his blade in poison, spamming Igni, and preferably trying to open as many arteries as humanly possible, while stoned out of his senses with at least 2 extremely lethal potions. One other common misconception about the Witchers is that their mutations rid them of their emotions. This belief is so common, many Witchers have actually started to believe in it themselves, modeling their personalities and body language to appear as heartless and uncaring of anyone else's problems as they were expected to be. And herein lies the root of the problem. it is also a lie. There are no biological obstacles for a Witcher to feel emotions, though I don't doubt that sorcerers who made the Witchers did not attempt to include this feature in the mutation process. After all, an obedient killer who cannot be distracted by such petty things as morality and compassion is far more valuable tool than a regular killer. Yet it is usually not the trial itself that leaves so many Witchers cold and stoic. It is their cruel, inhumane training, often combined with bullying from other apprentices, which helps make them aggressive, suspicious, and always alert, and the inhospitable, hostile environment they enter upon the completion of their training, in which they are seen as monsters by their prey and as freaks by humanity, that often cements this attitude in many young Witchers. Yet there are no biological obstacles for Witchers to develop feelings of friendship, camaraderie, or even love, as is evident throughout the story. It is merely very difficult for them. All of this, naturally, appears quite scary and unexplainable to anyone not well versed in the Witcherly ways, and it does not help that the Witchers will go to great lengths to protect their secrets from anyone and everyone. And when combined with a Witcher's scary appearance, habit of recruiting children, and especially the high salary they demand for their services, yeah, I would probably be grabbing a pitchfork as well. Or maybe not, seeing as I would most likely end up being chopped into jerky, as the Witchers only hate one thing more than oath-breakers: employers who try to cheat them out of their money. It appears we may not be so different from the Witchers after all. However, there is one book, and I use this word very loosely, written by an anonymous author that has helped cement the Witchers as monstrous money-hungry murderers, rapists and kidnappers amongst the general populace more than anything else. Monstrum, or Betrayal of a Hexer. This book, which claims to be a general treatise on Witchers, their habits and profession, is approximately what would happen if you let a Nazi write a scientific analysis on the Untermensch. It is literally page after page after page of unbridled vitriol aimed at pretty much every possible aspect of the Witchers, from how they fight and talk, all the way down to how exactly they like their morning porridge. And you might think I'm exaggerating here, so just let me read an excerpt. Quote, "It is well known that when a Witcher inflicts pain, suffering, and death, he experiences absolute ecstasy and bliss, such as a devout and normal man experiences during sexual congress with his wedded spouse, ibidem cum ejaculatio. This leads one to conclude that, also in this matter, a Witcher is a creature contrary to nature, an immoral and filthy degenerate, born of the blackest and most foul-smelling hell, since surely only a devil could derive bliss from suffering and pain." I swear, when I first read this book, I found it so comically overblown that I honestly thought only a medieval Slavic dystopia could produce such a piece of literature. Just so filled with misinformation, lies, and just outright hate, outbursts of anger, and immature levels of writing. And then I started reading about modern-day culture wars, and safe to say, I no longer find this book overblown. Despite often saving entire settlements from certain annihilation or eternal slavery to local wannabe deities, Witchers are considered only slightly better or more trustworthy than non-humans, and often 3 times as dangerous and unpredictable. The non-human races treat them differently. Most elves see them as abominations, a display of human hubris, and have little sympathy for them. Dwarves and gnomes, on the other hand, recognize their talents and often seek out their professional aid, and are usually more pleasant to work with than elves or humans. A dwarf's jovial nature and pragmatic approach to life is much more compatible with a Witcher's sense of professional pride than a human's self-righteous ignominy or an elf's vain glory. Dragons and vampires are usually too powerful to distinguish overtly between a Witcher and a mere human, and all the other sentient monsters see the Witchers as merciless murderers and hired thugs despising them almost as much as humans do. Yet in modern days, the number of witchers has dwindled. Why? There simply aren't enough monsters left to hunt. That is how good these hunters were at their jobs. Where once the forests were literally bursting with all kinds of huge predatory abominations, now most monsters have withdrawn themselves to the most backwater and forgotten parts of the old world, leaving the witchers without a sustainable income. Witchers have driven entire species to extinction single-handedly and pushed many more to the very edge of the abyss. Only monsters that remain in abundance are the ones that have learned to assimilate or adapt to a world ruled by humans. Necrophages, Zuguls, wraiths, and imps, scavengers and pests, not worth calling for a witcher to most people they trouble. It would appear the witchers were too effective for their own good. It is also worth noting that most witchers have no desire to put anyone else through their lethal training, especially through the infamous trial of grasses. Thus, their numbers have been steadily dwindling, and without purpose or replenishment, today their number is no larger than a couple hundred, perhaps even a couple dozen. Already they are seen as relics of the past by many, and the number of mercenary witchers forced to reject their honor in favor of survival grows by the day. All in all, a true witcher may soon become as extinct as the monsters he had been created to hunt. How fate loves its cruel ironies. Yet even if the witchers were ever to die out, they would not be forgotten. At least some of them, that is. For there are individuals amongst their number who have had quite an eventful and long life. Warriors who have earned the favor of kings, or lovers to sorceresses, and even took part in world-shattering events. One such individual is bound to be the topic of our next video. He is known by many men under many names: Ravix of Forhorn, Gwynblade, the Butcher of Blaviken, the Pale One, the White Wolf. But that is the story for another day.
At the end of the path, I rest my weary feet. At the end of the path, in quiet comfort.